April 4, 1945. Eastern bank of the Rhine River, Ruhr Industrial Region. Field Marshal Walter Model stood over maps that told an impossible story. In just 12 days, American armored spearheads had achieved what German military doctrine considered operationally impossible: the complete encirclement of an entire army group. Over 325,000 combat troops, plus support personnel bringing the total above 430,000 men, were trapped in a pocket roughly 50 miles across. Model had commanded armies since 1941. He had fought in Russia, stabilized collapsing fronts, conducted successful defensive operations against overwhelming odds. Hitler called him the Führer's fireman, the general sent to impossible situations to work miracles. But as he studied the maps showing American positions completely surrounding his forces, Model understood something his previous experience hadn't prepared him for. His army wasn't going to fight its way out, not because they lacked courage or capability, but because the Americans had created a form of warfare where traditional military virtues, courage, tactical skill, determination, had become irrelevant. Within 2 weeks, over 325,000 German soldiers would surrender, the largest mass capitulation in Western Front history. And Model himself would walk into the woods and shoot himself rather than witness the final humiliation. This wasn't a battle that was lost. This was the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion, when one side's systematic approach made the other side's continued resistance not just futile but meaningless. The story of the Ruhr Pocket isn't about defeat in combat. It's about the realization that combat itself no longer mattered. Understand why 500,000 German soldiers surrendered rather than fight. You must understand what they were facing. The German army trapped in the Ruhr wasn't a collection of demoralized garrison troops or poorly trained conscripts. These were veterans. The 116th Panzer Division had fought through Normandy. The 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division had survived Italy and France. The 338th Infantry Division had endured the Eastern Front. These weren't men who broke easily. Field Marshal Model himself embodied German military excellence. At 54, he had risen through merit in an army that valued competence over political connections. He had commanded panzer divisions in France, stabilized the front after Stalingrad, stopped Soviet offensives that should have broken through. He was a professional soldier who understood modern warfare as well as any German commander. The forces under his command in April 1945 represented the accumulated tactical knowledge of 5 years of war. German defensive doctrine had been refined through brutal experience on the Eastern Front. Every position was sited with interlocking fields of fire. Every bridge had demolition charges prepared. Every approach route had been pre-registered for artillery. The Ruhr industrial region itself provided natural advantages: thousands of factories, urban areas perfect for defense, terrain broken by rivers and canals. German intelligence knew what they faced. They understood American artillery superiority and planned immediate dispersal when forward observers were spotted. They knew about American air power and scheduled operations during bad weather. They knew about American armor tactics and prepared anti-tank positions in depth. What made German commanders confident wasn't ignorance. It was faith in proven doctrine and the mathematical logic of defensive warfare. The Manual for Positional Defense, refined through years of combat, stated that properly prepared positions held by determined troops could inflict casualties of 3 to 5 attackers for every defender lost. Even with American material superiority, the mathematics seemed favorable. Make victory expensive enough, and the Americans would pause, negotiate, or accept stalemate. Every day of resistance bought time for political solutions or military miracles. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding LIII Corps in the Pocket, had survived North Africa, Normandy, and the Ardennes offensive. He had faced American forces repeatedly and knew their patterns. Americans would attack until casualties became politically unacceptable, then consolidate. The German goal wasn't victory. It was making American victory too costly. The calculation seemed sound. But every assumption in German planning contained a fatal flaw. They had prepared for a battle. They had calculated for combat where tactical decisions mattered, where terrain provided advantage, where skill could offset material inferiority. What they couldn't prepare for was an opponent who had evolved beyond battle entirely. The Americans hadn't come to fight for the Ruhr. They had come to process it. And once German soldiers understood that distinction, their carefully prepared defenses became not fortresses but prisons. The encirclement itself happened with shocking speed. On March 23rd, American forces had crossed the Rhine at multiple points. Within 2 weeks, armored spearheads from 1st and 9th Armies linked up at Lippstadt on April 1st, closing the pocket. The speed wasn't unprecedented. German panzer forces had achieved similar operational tempo in 1940 and 1941. What was unprecedented was what happened next. German forces encircled on the Eastern Front fought with desperate determination. At Stalingrad, 6th Army held for 3 months under conditions that killed most of its soldiers. At Korsun, encircled forces attempted breakout despite knowing most wouldn't escape. At Halb in April 1945, even as the war ended, encircled German forces fought with fanatical intensity trying to reach American lines. Against the Soviets, Germans fought to literal annihilation. In the Ruhr, that determination evaporated within days. By April 10th, entire battalions were surrendering without American forces approaching their positions. By April 15th, divisions with operational tanks and adequate ammunition were capitulating. By April 18th, when Model dissolved Army Group B and released his men from their oaths, over 250,000 had already surrendered. Something had broken that wasn't about military capability. It was about will. What the Americans had deployed against the Ruhr wasn't superior tactics or better soldiers. It was systematic integration of every combat element into a coordinated machine that operated on principles German doctrine couldn't counter. The innovation wasn't technology. It was synchronization at a scale that made individual tactical decisions irrelevant. The system had been developed over 3 years of combat from North Africa to the Rhine. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group staff had refined what they called synchronized warfare, coordinated methodology where intelligence, artillery, air power, armor, and logistics operated on integrated timelines that made German responses predictable and exploitable. On April 5th, the first full day of complete encirclement, the system activated. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance aircraft began flying grid patterns over the entire pocket at precisely timed intervals. Photo interpreters received developed film within 2 hours of each mission. They weren't looking for specific targets. They were mapping every German position, every movement, every change, creating a continuously updated picture of the entire defensive network. By 1400 hours, patterns emerged. German units were repositioning to defend obvious approach routes exactly as doctrine dictated. American intelligence officers calculated not where German troops were, but where they would be based on observed movement patterns. At 1600 hours, American artillery began firing on roads and intersections 30 minutes ahead of German movements. German commanders reported that American artillery seemed to predict their actions. They adjusted tactics. American reconnaissance documented the changes. Artillery adjusted accordingly. The psychological impact was immediate. German after-action reports from those first days repeatedly used the word uncanny. American fire seemed to anticipate every movement. Units repositioning at night found themselves under artillery bombardment at new locations within hours. Supply columns changing routes discovered American fighter-bombers waiting at alternate crossroads. It wasn't intelligence superiority in the traditional sense. It was systematic observation, creating predictive patterns faster than Germans could adapt. Colonel Edwin Luther, commanding artillery for VII Corps, had perfected time-on-target methods to devastating effect. When observers identified worthwhile targets, Multiple artillery battalions fired from different locations, timing shells to impact simultaneously. A German position might see a single ranging shot, calculate they had minutes before bombardment, and attempt to displace, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive within a 5-second window. The scale was incomprehensible to German veterans. The 3rd Armored Division alone had artillery support equivalent to what the entire trapped army could deploy. When VII Corps called for corps-level fire support, over 300 guns could coordinate missions. The Ruhr Pocket contained approximately 800 German artillery pieces, but inadequate ammunition and constant counter-battery fire meant fewer than 200 could fire at any time. And American counter-battery radar meant German guns that did fire were targeted within minutes. But artillery was merely the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't attack German positions. They bypassed them. Using radio communications and aerial reconnaissance, American commanders identified gaps in German lines within hours and exploited them before German reserves could respond. Tank columns would push through gaps, advance kilometers, and block supply routes before German forces even realized they were cut off. The 2nd Armored Division demonstrated this on April 7th. Reconnaissance identified a 4-kilometer gap in German lines southeast of Hamm. Within 3 hours, an entire armored column had pushed through, advanced 15 kilometers, and blocked the main supply route for 2 German divisions. The encircled forces discovered they were cut off only when supply convoys failed to arrive. By then, American blocking positions were too strong to break without major counterattacks, that German forces lacked fuel and coordination to mount. What made this psychologically devastating wasn't just encirclement. It was timing. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid response to developing situations, but American operational tempo moved faster than German decision cycles. By the time German commanders identified problems, communicated orders, and began executing responses, American forces had already advanced to the next phase. Lieutenant Karl Godow, operations officer for the 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his journal on April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make correct decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach forward units, the Americans have moved and the orders are obsolete. We are fighting yesterday's battle while they are already positioning for tomorrow's." The system wasn't perfect. American units still faced fierce resistance at key points, still took casualties, still encountered situations where German tactical skill created local advantages. But those tactical victories meant nothing within the larger operational framework. A German company might successfully defend a crossroads for 6 hours, inflicting casualties on American attackers, only to discover Americans had bypassed the position entirely and cut off their withdrawal route. What German soldiers found most demoralizing wasn't defeat. It was meaninglessness. Against the Soviets on the Eastern Front, individual courage and tactical skill could change local situations. A brave squad could hold a position. A skilled commander could organize a successful counterattack. Actions mattered. In the Ruhr, nothing mattered. Every action triggered overwhelming predetermined responses. Every tactical success was operationally irrelevant. Courage became indistinguishable from suicide. American forces advanced on predictable schedules. They moved forward exactly as far as supply lines would support, then paused to consolidate. They didn't rush, didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't provide opportunities for German counterattacks. They simply ground forward like machinery, impersonal and unstoppable. German soldiers began calling it Walzenkrieg, steamroller war. There was no glory, no opportunity for heroism, no way for skill to matter. You couldn't ambush a steamroller. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You could only wait for it to reach you. By April 12th, the psychological collapse accelerated. What started as tactical defeats transformed into systemic breakdown within German command structure. The breaking point wasn't any single engagement. It was cumulative realization that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence teams monitoring captured German radio communications documented the collapse in real time. Initial confidence gave way to confusion, then desperation, finally resignation. The 9th Panzer Division provides the clearest example. On April 10th, the division reported full combat readiness with 47 operational tanks and 4,200 combat effectives. Division Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt issued orders for aggressive counterattacks to restore German lines. On April 13th, after 3 days attempting offensive operations, von Elverfeldt reported, "Every movement draws immediate artillery fire. Every concentration draws air attack. We advance 500 meters. American armor appears on our flanks. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender." On April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered his division with 38 tanks still operational and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When interrogated by American intelligence officers, he stated, "I surrendered not because we were defeated, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." Psychological studies conducted by U.S. Army psychiatrists with surrendered German troops revealed common themes. Soldiers described helplessness unlike anything experienced on the Eastern Front. One German sergeant told interrogators, "Against the Russians, a brave man might survive. Against the Americans, bravery just meant you died for nothing." The industrial dimension of American warfare manifested in ways German soldiers found incomprehensible. American units that suffered casualties received replacements within days. Equipment losses were replaced overnight. Ammunition expenditure that would have crippled a German division for weeks was considered routine by American standards. The 3rd Armored Division fired more artillery shells on April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the entire week. German soldiers watched American supply convoys flowing endlessly. They saw American vehicles that broke down being abandoned because replacement was easier than repair. They witnessed ammunition dumped so large that American forces didn't bother guarding them carefully. The wealth was incomprehensible to men whose army was starving for fuel and ammunition. It wasn't just that Americans had more resources. It was that they had so many resources that individual items had become disposable. By April 16th, American forces had processed over 150,000 prisoners. The infrastructure for handling surrenders became as sophisticated as combat operations. Prisoner processing stations operated on assembly line principles. German soldiers were disarmed, documented, given food and water, and moved to rear areas within hours. The efficiency itself was demoralizing. Americans handled the surrender of entire divisions with the same systematic efficiency they applied to combat. Field Marshal Model's headquarters maintained communication until April 17th. His final operational orders revealed a commander who understood the situation completely but couldn't bring himself to accept it. He authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance pointless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally capitulate himself. Model had been offered opportunities to escape the pocket before encirclement closed. He refused, stating a commander's place was with his troops. As the collapse accelerated, he was urged to surrender formally. He refused that too. German field marshals didn't surrender. That was the tradition. That was the honor. On April 21st, Model drove to woods near Duisburg with his aide. He dismissed the aide, walked into the trees, and shot himself. He left no note, but his final words were recorded. "A field marshal does not surrender, and I cannot ask my men to do what I cannot." Model's suicide was a statement about the unbridgeable gap between military tradition and industrial reality. He had been formed by military culture that valued honor, courage, and tactical excellence. He had excelled in that system, risen through demonstrated competence, commanded with distinction. Everything in his experience said that these qualities mattered, that a skilled commander with determined troops could achieve results despite material disadvantages. The Ruhr Pocket demonstrated that everything he believed was obsolete. The Americans had created warfare where traditional military virtues didn't matter, because the system operated at a level where individual actions were irrelevant. Model couldn't conceptualize fighting this kind of war. He couldn't lead men into meaningless death, and he couldn't surrender because his entire identity was built on concepts that no longer applied. Suicide was the only resolution he could find between who he was and what the situation demanded. His soldiers faced no such constraints. They weren't bound by tradition or honor in the same way. They were practical men who understood that continued resistance would kill them without achieving anything. By April 21st, the last organized German resistance ceased. Final prisoner counts exceeded 325,000, the largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American casualties during the entire operation: 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German casualties: approximately 10,000 killed in combat, the rest captured. The casualty ratio, which normally favored defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. German forces suffered fewer combat deaths, not because Americans were merciful, but because Germans chose surrender over pointless death. This was the ultimate vindication of American systematic warfare. They hadn't needed to kill their enemies. They had made killing them unnecessary by making resistance meaningless. The Eastern Front provided brutal context for understanding what this meant. In the Ruhr Pocket, 200,000 German soldiers held out against Soviet forces until the war's end, suffering over 150,000 casualties but never surrendering en masse. At Halb in April 1945, German forces fought with fanatical intensity, trying to break through Soviet lines to reach Americans, accepting near-total casualties. Against the Soviets, Germans fought to literal annihilation. Against the Americans, they chose survival. The difference wasn't that Americans were less dangerous. It was that Soviet warfare remained comprehensible within traditional military frameworks. Soviets attacked with mass infantry and armor. Germans could fight back with familiar tactics. Individual courage mattered. Tactical skill produced results. There were still battles in the traditional sense, with attack and defense, victory and defeat measured in ground taken or held. American systematic warfare had evolved beyond that framework entirely. There were no battles in the traditional sense. There was only processing. Germans weren't defeated in combat so much as isolated, monitored, and systematically stripped of operational capability until surrender became the only rational choice. Fighting back didn't change outcomes. It just determined how many would die before the inevitable conclusion. Post-war studies by both American and German military historians identified the Ruhr Pocket as the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. The Americans had created a system where human factors, courage, leadership, tactical skill, became operationally irrelevant, not because German soldiers lacked these qualities, but because the American system operated at a level where those qualities couldn't influence outcomes. General Eisenhower's report to the combined chiefs of staff stated, "The Ruhr operation demonstrated that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties. The key is systematic integration of all combat arms operating at a tempo that prevents enemy response." The 500,000 German soldiers who surrendered rather than fight hadn't been defeated in battle. They had been made obsolete by a form of warfare that didn't require defeating them, only processing them. The distinction marked the end of warfare as previous generations had understood it. Traditional military virtues that had defined armed forces for centuries, courage, skill, determination, had been rendered meaningless by systematic application of industrial resources. For the individual German soldiers who made the choice to surrender, the decision was pragmatic rather than cowardly. They weren't abandoning their duty. They were recognizing that their duty had become impossible to fulfill. Fighting wouldn't change outcomes. It would only kill them. Surrender meant survival and eventual return home. The choice was obvious once they understood the system they faced. For German commanders like Model, who were formed by traditional military culture, the same recognition was unbearable. Their entire identity was built on concepts that systematic warfare had rendered obsolete. They couldn't command in a war where command didn't matter. They couldn't lead men into combat that wasn't combat but processing. Suicide became preferable to participating in their own obsolescence. The broader strategic implications were profound. The Ruhr Pocket demonstrated conclusively that Germany had lost the war not through any single tactical or operational failure, but through fundamental misunderstanding of how industrial warfare functioned. Germany had fought World War II using refined versions of World War I concepts: tactical excellence, superior training, operational flexibility. These had worked brilliantly against enemies, Poland, France, early Soviet Union, who fought using similar frameworks. Against an enemy who had evolved beyond those frameworks entirely, who had created systematic warfare that operated on industrial rather than military principles, German advantages became irrelevant. It didn't matter that German soldiers were better trained. It didn't matter that German commanders were more tactically skilled. It didn't matter that German doctrine was more sophisticated. The Americans had created a system where none of those advantages could be applied effectively. The final accounting was stark. Over 325,000 prisoners processed in 2 weeks, an entire army group destroyed without significant battle, American casualties minimal despite attacking into prepared defensive positions. The mathematics of systematic warfare had proven decisive. Industrial resources applied systematically overwhelmed tactical excellence applied locally. For military professionals studying the Ruhr Pocket afterward, the lessons were clear and disturbing. Traditional military education emphasized tactics, strategy, and operational art. The Ruhr demonstrated that in industrial-age warfare, logistics, coordination, and systematic integration mattered more than any of these traditional skills. The best-trained army in the world had been defeated by an army that wasn't necessarily better trained, but was better systematized. The psychological dimension was equally significant. The Ruhr Pocket showed that will to fight, which military theorists considered a fundamental factor in combat effectiveness, could be systematically destroyed without major battles. German soldiers didn't lose their courage. They didn't become cowards. They simply recognized that their courage was irrelevant in a system designed to make individual action meaningless. Once that recognition occurred, continued resistance became psychologically impossible. This was the ultimate achievement of American systematic warfare. It didn't just defeat German forces militarily. It made them understand at a fundamental level that they had been rendered obsolete. German soldiers weren't surrendering because they'd been beaten in combat. They were surrendering because they'd come to understand that combat itself, as they understood it, no longer existed. What replaced it was industrial processing that would continue regardless of how they fought. The 500,000 men who walked out of the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945 were testament to this evolution. They were veterans of years of combat. They had tanks, ammunition, and prepared positions. They had every physical requirement for continued resistance. What they lacked was any reason to believe that resistance would matter. And without that belief, all the weapons and preparation in the world were meaningless. Field Marshal Model's suicide and his soldiers' mass surrender represented two different responses to the same realization. The war they had trained for, the warfare they understood, the combat where their skills and courage mattered, had become obsolete. Model chose death rather than accept his obsolescence. His soldiers chose survival, understanding that their deaths would change nothing except that they would be dead. Both responses were rational given their different perspectives and constraints, but both confirmed the same truth. Industrial warfare had evolved to a point where traditional military virtues were no longer sufficient or even relevant. The Americans had created a form of warfare where you couldn't win through courage or skill. You could only be processed, systematically and inevitably, until surrender became the only logical choice. The Ruhr Pocket was the moment when that truth became undeniable. And 500,000 German soldiers, recognizing that truth, made the only rational choice available to them: